The blood that moved. The winter of 1864 hit the small town of Blackwood, Massachusetts like a hammer. Heavy snow covered the stone streets, and freezing winds screamed through the bare tree branches around the town square. Street lamps made weak circles of light in the falling snow. Only the bravest people went outside, wrapped in thick coats and fur hats. This was when Dr. James Thornfield met a patient who would shake everything he thought he knew about medicine. Dr. Thornfield had opened his medical office in Blackwood after finishing school at Harvard Medical School. He was one of the first doctors trained to use microscopes to study illness. The Civil War was still going on in the South, but it barely touched this northern town. Many of his classmates had gone to be army doctors, but Dr. Thornfield had a bad leg from getting sick as a child, so the army wouldn't take him. Instead, he spent his time learning about medicine through careful study and research. His small office was next to his house on Elm Street. It had one of the only microscopes in the whole county. He had paid a lot of money for this brass microscope from Germany. It sat on his wooden desk like a symbol of modern science. The doctor was proud to be using the newest medical methods, even in this small town far from the big cities. Dr. Thornfield was 34 years old and had never married. He spent so much time on medicine that he never found time for romance. His housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, took care of his house. She made sure his clothes were clean, his food was hot, and his medical supplies were ready. The townspeople respected him for being smart and keeping their secrets. Some of the older people still liked the herb medicines from Mrs. Wilkins, the midwife who had helped deliver babies for almost 40 years. Most winter days, the doctor saw the usual sick people: coughs, fevers, chills, and broken bones from slipping on ice. He wrote down everything he saw in leather notebooks. His neat handwriting filled page after page with notes about his patients. In the evenings, he read medical journals by lamplight. Sometimes he wrote letters to his old classmates about interesting cases or new treatments. This quiet routine had been his life for 5 years. He was comfortable with how predictable it was. He had no reason to think the blizzard of January 1864 would bring him a patient who would change his understanding of human bodies and challenge everything he thought he knew about medical science. On the morning of January 12th, the town was hit by a terrible blizzard. Snow had been falling since midnight and wasn't stopping. Snow was already piling up against doors and windows. The doctor had just started a fire in his office stove, feeling grateful for its warmth, when he heard desperate pounding at his door. The heavy metal door knocker rarely made such a panic sound. He put down his morning cup of tea and straightened his vest as he got up. Looking out the window after wiping away the frost, he saw a black carriage covered in snow pulled up to his gate. The poor horses stood with their heads down against the wind, steam coming from their noses. The driver, wrapped in heavy wool and a fur hat, was helping a well-dressed man carry what looked like a child's body wrapped in blankets toward his door. The gentleman's top hat was gone, blown away by the wind. His expensive coat was covered with white snow, making him look like a ghost in the swirling snow. "Doctor, please, you must help us," the gentleman called out. His voice was almost lost in the howling wind. His face was twisted with fear and worry. Dr. Thornfield rushed to open the door. Cold air immediately bit at his face as he brought them into the warmth of his examination room. His medical training took over, pushing aside questions about what had brought these strangers to Blackwood in such terrible weather. "What happened?" he asked urgently. He cleared his examination table with a sweep of his arm, sending his morning mail flying to the floor. The gentleman introduced himself as Edward Marsh, a businessman from Boston. He carefully laid the bundle on the table. Snow melted from his expensive boots onto the polished wooden floor as he hovered anxiously. His face, now visible in the gaslight, was handsome but worn with deep lines of a man who had worried for a long time. "My daughter Evelyn," he said, his voice breaking. "She's always been weak, but this morning she wouldn't wake up. Her teacher found her like this, cold and barely breathing. We've been staying at the Blackwood Inn since yesterday, waiting for the storm to pass before continuing our trip." Dr. Thornfield carefully unwrapped the blankets and found a girl of about 13 years. Her skin was as white as the snow outside, with long red-brown hair around a delicate face. Her lips had a strange blue color, and her breathing was so shallow that he had to hold a small mirror under her nose to make sure she was still alive. She wore a nightgown made of fine cotton with fancy stitching at the collar and cuffs, clearly the clothing of a rich family's child. "Has she been sick?" the doctor asked, putting his stethoscope on her chest. Her heartbeat was there, but strangely slow and uneven, like a clock that was running down. "She's never been strong," Mr. Marsh replied, wringing his hands. His gold ring caught the light as he gestured helplessly. "My wife died giving birth to her. Evelyn has always been prone to fainting spells and weakness. Several doctors in Boston have treated her over the years, but none could find out what was wrong. We were traveling to see a specialist in New York when the storm got worse. We took shelter here in Blackwood last night, and this morning she wouldn't respond." The doctor nodded, already reaching for his medical bag. "How long has she been like this?" The teacher went to wake her for breakfast at 7 o'clock. "It's now." Mr. Marsh pulled an ornate pocket watch from his vest. "Nearly 9 o'clock, so 2 hours that we know of. She seemed fine when I said good night to her yesterday evening, though perhaps quieter than usual." Dr. Thornfield rolled up his sleeves. He had seen people with hypothermia before, but never one quite like this. The girl's skin was cold, but it had an unusual waxy quality that didn't match his experience with people who had been exposed to freezing temperatures. And the room at the inn would surely have been heated. "I'll need to examine her carefully," he said. "Perhaps you could wait in the sitting room. Mrs. Collins, my housekeeper, will bring you some hot tea. You look half frozen yourself." Reluctantly, Mr. Marsh let Mrs. Collins lead him from the room. She had appeared quietly in the doorway, hearing the commotion. As they left, Dr. Thornfield could hear him explaining why they were in Blackwood during such bad weather. Something about important business in New York that couldn't wait, despite the winter conditions. Alone with his patient, Dr. Thornfield began his examination with careful precision. He had treated unconscious patients before, victims of accidents, people drunk on alcohol, and various forms of stroke. But something about Evelyn Marsh's condition felt fundamentally different from anything he had experienced. The girl's temperature was dangerously low, her pulse weak and irregular. When he lifted her eyelids with his thumb, her pupils reacted strangely to the lamplight. They contracted to tiny points and then expanded again in a rhythm that didn't match the changes in light. He noticed an unusual pattern on the skin of her arms and legs, almost like marble with thin blue veins visible beneath the see-through surface. Using his thermometer, a new invention he had ordered from Philadelphia, he measured her temperature at just 95 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the normal 98.6 degrees. Such a reading would usually indicate dangerous hypothermia. Yet her body showed none of the shivering or other responses one would expect. Moving step by step, he checked her reflexes using his percussion hammer, tapping just below her kneecaps. The response was small but present. Her breathing remained shallow and slow, perhaps 8 breaths per minute compared to the normal 16 to 20 for a child her age. Yet her color, while pale, didn't show the bluish tint around the lips and fingernails that would suggest she wasn't getting enough oxygen. When he gently lifted one of her eyelids again for a closer look, he was shocked to find that her eyes, which should have been a single color, seemed to contain swirling patterns of blue and gray, shifting like smoke or ink dropped into water. He blinked, wondering if the light from the gas lamp was creating an optical illusion. But the movement continued, mesmerizing in its fluid complexity. "Most unusual," he murmured to himself, making notes in his journal. In his 5 years of practice, he had never seen anything similar. Even in the medical books he had studied so carefully, there was no mention of eyes that contained such movement or of a condition that produced such a deep state of reduced body function without more serious signs of distress. Troubled by these strange symptoms, the doctor decided to take a small amount of blood to examine under his microscope. Taking a thin silver blade from his medical bag, he made a tiny cut on the pad of her index finger. What came out was not the bright red he expected, but something of a darker color, almost dark red with an unusual thickness. It flowed more slowly than normal blood, and as he collected a drop on a glass slide, he noticed something extraordinary. The droplet seemed to move on its own, not simply spreading as liquid should, but shifting in deliberate, almost purposeful patterns. "Impossible," he whispered. His scientific mind immediately looked for rational explanations. Perhaps a tremor in his hand had disturbed the drop, or some property of the glass slide was affecting the fluid's behavior. Yet even as he held the slide perfectly still, the blood continued its strange independent movement. Both intrigued and disturbed, Dr. Thornfield hurried to his microscope with hands that shook slightly with excitement or fear. He wasn't sure which. He placed the slide on the stage and adjusted the focus. What he saw through the eyepiece defied everything he had learned at medical school. Normal human blood, he knew, contained distinct parts. The red cells that carried oxygen, the white cells that fought disease, and the smaller platelets that helped with clotting. These structures should have been clearly visible under the microscope's magnification, floating separately in the plasma like islands in a sea. But Evelyn's blood showed none of these. Instead, the field of vision revealed what seemed to be a uniform fluid that moved in intricate flowing patterns, almost like currents in a tiny sea. Occasionally it formed shapes that reminded him of primitive sea creatures before dissolving and reforming elsewhere. There were no distinct cells, no separate components, only this continuous, purposeful movement. Dr. Thornfield adjusted the focus, certain he must be seeing a mistake in his preparation or a flaw in his technique. He had examined hundreds of blood samples during his training and had become skilled at identifying various diseases through microscopic analysis. But this was something entirely outside his experience or understanding. The doctor pulled back from the microscope, rubbing his eyes in disbelief. He prepared a second slide, certain he must have contaminated the first sample somehow, but the result was identical. Movement without cells, life without structure. "Impossible," he whispered again, though the evidence of his own eyes contradicted his words. He thought of Rudolf Virchow's work on cellular pathology, the basic principle that all cells arise from pre-existing cells, that the cell was the fundamental unit of all living things. Yet here before him was evidence that challenged that very premise, a living fluid that contained no cellular structures at all, only patterns of movement. For a moment, the doctor felt dizzy, as if the solid ground of his scientific understanding had shifted beneath his feet. He gripped the edge of his desk, steadying himself, his gaze returning to the unconscious girl on his examination table. What was she? How could her blood sustain life without the structures that science deemed essential? Composing himself, Dr. Thornfield returned to his patient. Her condition remained unchanged, suspended between life and death. The doctor covered her with warm blankets and placed hot water bottles around her body to gradually raise her temperature. He mixed a solution of camphor and ammonia spirits, applying it to her nostrils, hoping that the strong scent might wake her up. But there was no response. Uncertain what else he could do for her medically given the mysterious nature of her condition, he returned to his desk, pulling down medical textbooks from his shelves. He searched desperately for any reference to a condition that might explain what he was seeing. He looked through books on kidney diseases, anemia, even the more obscure works on rare blood disorders that he had collected during his studies. None described anything remotely similar to what he had observed in Evelyn Marsh's blood. As he searched, his mind raced with questions. Was this some unknown disease? A birth defect unique to this child, or something else entirely, something that might force him to reconsider the very nature of human biology? Hours passed. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping. The wind howled around the house like a living thing. Occasionally, Dr. Thornfield would pause in his research to check on Evelyn, monitoring her pulse and temperature, but her condition remained stable in its strangeness, neither improving nor getting worse. Mr. Marsh paced the sitting room, occasionally coming to ask about his daughter's condition. Dr. Thornfield could offer little comfort, only that Evelyn's temperature had stabilized, though she remained unconscious. He chose not to share his observations about her blood, uncertain how to explain something he himself could barely understand. "I've seen these episodes before," Mr. Marsh confided during one such visit to the examination room. He stood by his daughter's side, gently stroking her hair, though never quite this severe or long-lasting. She'll fall into these states of unresponsiveness, cold to the touch, barely breathing. Then after hours or sometimes days, she'll wake as if from a deep sleep with no memory of the time that's passed. And no doctor has been able to diagnose the cause? Dr. Thornfield asked, watching the father's face carefully. Mr. Marsh shook his head, his expression haunted. They've called it everything from catalepsy to hysteria to a form of epilepsy. None of their treatments have made any difference. The episodes come and go according to their own rhythm. He sighed heavily. That's why we're seeking out Dr. Winfield in New York. He's said to have had success with unusual nervous conditions. Dr. Thornfield made a mental note of the name. Winfield was known in medical circles for his unconventional approaches, walking the line between established practice and experimental techniques. Some respected him as a visionary. Others dismissed him as a fraud. Has anyone examined her blood before? The doctor asked, trying to sound casual. A shadow crossed Mr. Marsh's face. The last doctor who attempted to draw her blood. The results were inconclusive. The sample was said to have been contaminated somehow. Contaminated? Dr. Thornfield prompted. So they claimed. I was not permitted to see it myself. Mr. Marsh's tone suggested he believed there was more to the story than he had been told. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Collins announcing that she had prepared a late lunch. Mr. Marsh reluctantly left his daughter's side to eat something, leaving the doctor alone once more with his mysterious patient. As evening approached, the light outside fading from gray to deeper gray, the doctor was startled by a sound from the examination table, a soft moan. He rushed to Evelyn's side to find her eyelids fluttering. Slowly, they opened, revealing those strange swirling eyes, now more active in their movement, like storm clouds stirred by wind. "Father," she whispered, her voice as delicate as spun glass. "Your father is here, Miss Marsh," the doctor said gently, taking her wrist to check her pulse, which had strengthened considerably. "You're safe. I'm Dr. Thornfield. You're in my care in the town of Blackwood." The girl's eyes focused on him, and he was struck by the intelligence and awareness in them. Despite her weakened state, there was no confusion, no disorientation, as one might expect after such a prolonged unconsciousness. "The storm," she said. "I could hear it in my dreams. It was calling to me." Before the doctor could respond to this curious statement, Mr. Marsh burst into the room, having heard his daughter's voice. The reunion was tender, the father clasping his daughter's hand and brushing hair from her forehead with trembling fingers. "My dear girl, you gave us such a fright," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, Father," Evelyn replied, her voice stronger now. "It happened again, didn't it? The cold sleep." Mr. Marsh nodded, exchanging a meaningful glance with the doctor. "Dr. Thornfield has been taking good care of you." The doctor cleared his throat. "Miss Marsh, your father tells me you've experienced similar episodes before. Can you describe how you felt before this one came on?" Evelyn's gaze drifted to the window where snow continued to fall in the gathering darkness. Her expression took on a distant quality, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. After a long moment, she returned her attention to the doctor. "It always begins with a pulling sensation, as if something is drawing me away from myself. Then comes the cold, starting in my fingertips and toes, spreading inward. My thoughts become distant. I hear whispers that I cannot quite understand, and then nothing until I wake." Dr. Thornfield made notes as she spoke, impressed by her clear description. Most children her age, indeed most adults, would struggle to describe their symptoms with such precision and poetry. "And how do you feel now?" he asked. "Tired," she admitted. "But the pulling has stopped. For now. I'd like to keep you under observation overnight," the doctor said, addressing both Evelyn and her father. "The storm makes travel impossible anyway. I've had Mrs. Collins prepare a room for you and your father." "That's very kind of you, Doctor," Mr. Marsh said, the relief evident in his voice. "I confess I would feel better knowing Evelyn was under medical supervision tonight in case I slip away again," Evelyn finished for him with a sad smile that seemed far too knowing for a child. "It's all right, Father. You can speak of it plainly. I'm not afraid." But the look that passed between father and daughter suggested that fear was indeed present, if not in the child, then certainly in the parent who had watched her slip between consciousness and whatever lay beyond it too many times before. Mrs. Collins appeared with a tray containing light soup for Evelyn and a more substantial meal for her father. Dr. Thornfield excused himself to allow them to eat in privacy, retreating to his study where the puzzle of Evelyn's blood still awaited him on the stage of his microscope. The samples had dried somewhat during the hours he'd spent monitoring his patient, but adding a drop of salt water brought the strange fluid back to life. Through the eyepiece he could see that the movement had slowed but not stopped entirely. The patterns were different now, less chaotic, more organized, as if the substance were gathering itself into more coherent structures. Dr. Thornfield sketched what he observed, trying to capture the fluid dynamics in still images. His drawings fell short of the reality, but they might serve as a record if he ever dared to share his observations with colleagues, though who would believe him without seeing it for themselves? And how could he explain taking blood from a child patient for others to examine without her father's explicit consent? Later that evening, after Evelyn had been settled into a comfortable bed upstairs and her father had retired to an adjacent room, Dr. Thornfield returned to his study. Sleep eluded him as he pored over his medical texts by lamplight, searching for any condition that might explain Evelyn's symptoms and the bizarre properties of her blood. Near midnight, he heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. Expecting to find Mr. Marsh checking on his daughter, he was surprised to discover Evelyn herself, dressed in a white nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, standing in the doorway of his study. The gas light caught the red-brown highlights in her hair, creating a halo-like effect that gave her an otherworldly appearance. "Miss Marsh, you should be resting," he said gently, rising from his desk. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her gaze drawn to the microscope on his desk. "What did you see in my blood, doctor?" The directness of her question took him aback. Children of her age and era were typically sheltered from medical details, especially concerning their own conditions. And how had she known he had examined her blood at all? "How did you know I examined your blood?" he asked, studying her face. A small knowing smile curved her lips. "I always know when it's been drawn. I can feel it leaving me, like saying farewell to a small part of myself." She moved closer to his desk, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "The other doctors never tell me what they find. They whisper to my father behind closed doors, prescribe tonics and treatments that never work, and exchange troubled glances when they think I'm not looking." Her perceptiveness was unsettling. Most children, even clever ones, did not observe the world with such sharpness or speak of their observations with such eloquence. Dr. Thornfield hesitated, uncertain how much to share with this strange, perceptive child. Professional ethics suggested he should discuss his findings with her father first, but something in Evelyn's steady gaze compelled him to honesty. "Your blood is unlike any I've ever seen," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "It lacks the cellular structures that should be present. Yet I live," she said simply. "Yes, which defies all medical understanding." Evelyn nodded as if his confirmation merely supported what she already knew. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the microscope. After a moment's hesitation, Dr. Thornfield nodded. He prepared a fresh slide, pricking his own finger for a comparison sample, then one from Evelyn, who didn't flinch at the small pain of the blade. He showed her how to look through the eyepiece, first at his own blood, explaining the components she could see, the numerous red cells, the occasional white cell. "They look like islands," she observed, "floating in a clear sea." "An apt description," he agreed. "The red cells carry oxygen from your lungs to the rest of your body. The white cells, which you can see here," he adjusted the focus slightly, "fight disease." When he replaced it with the slide containing her blood, he heard her sharp intake of breath. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eye pressed to the microscope, "like the patterns frost makes on a window, always changing." "You're not surprised," the doctor observed. Evelyn straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I've always known I was different, doctor. I feel it in every breath, every heartbeat. I'm not like other children." Not like anyone, perhaps. Has it always been this way? Have you always had these episodes of cold sleep, as you call them? She nodded, moving to stand by the window, looking out at the snow-covered street illuminated by the gas lamps. For as long as I can remember, they've grown more frequent as I've gotten older and longer. Father fears that one day I might not wake at all. She turned back to him, her expression solemn. Sometimes I wonder if that might be a mercy. Don't say such things, Dr. Thornfield said sharply, disturbed by the fatalism in one so young. Where there's life, there's hope for understanding and treatment. Evelyn turned back to him with a sad smile. Is that what you believe, Doctor? That science can explain everything? That everything in this world has a rational cause that can be observed under your microscope? The question unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As a man of science, he was committed to the principle that natural laws governed all phenomena, that mystery was merely the space between current knowledge and future discovery. Yet Evelyn's condition, her very existence, challenged those beliefs. I believe that with careful observation and reasoned analysis, we can come to understand even the most puzzling conditions, he said finally. Then I shall be your greatest challenge, she replied with a wisdom far beyond her years. Good night, Dr. Thornfield. Thank you for your honesty. She slipped from the room as quietly as she had entered, leaving the doctor with more questions than answers. Dr. Thornfield remained in his study for another hour, recording their conversation in his journal while it was fresh in his mind. He noted not only her strange physical condition but also her remarkable mental sharpness and self-awareness. Was this too related to her unusual biology? Or was it simply the result of an isolated childhood spent largely in the company of adults, as was often the case with sick children? Eventually, tiredness overcame curiosity, and he retired to his bedroom. His sleep was troubled by dreams of swirling patterns and whispers just beyond the range of understanding, of cold depths where unknown creatures moved in eternal darkness. He woke at dawn, his mind still filled with questions about his unusual patient. Dressing quickly, he went first to check on Evelyn, expecting to find her still asleep after her midnight wanderings. To his surprise, she was sitting up in bed, reading a book of poetry she must have taken from his library. "You're awake early, Miss Marsh," he remarked, entering after a soft knock. "I don't require much sleep," she replied, closing the book. "Not after a cold sleep. It's as if I've stored up rest like a squirrel hoards nuts for winter." The doctor smiled at the comparison. "And how are you feeling this morning?" "Better. The pulling sensation is completely gone now." "Good. I'd like to conduct a few more examinations, with your father's permission, of course." Evelyn nodded, though something in her expression suggested she found the deference to her father's authority unnecessary or amusing. "He'll agree. He always does when doctors wish to examine me. He's desperate for answers." The blizzard continued through the night and into the next day, making departure impossible. The roads were impassable, telegraph lines down. Blackwood was isolated, and so the Marshes remained under Dr. Thornfield's roof, an arrangement that suited the doctor's scientific curiosity perfectly. Dr. Thornfield used the time to conduct further examinations of Evelyn, with her father's permission. Her temperature remained lower than normal, her heartbeat slower, yet she showed no signs of distress, maintaining a calm manner throughout his tests. "You say her mother died in childbirth?" the doctor asked Mr. Marsh while Evelyn was resting in the afternoon. They sat in his study sharing a pot of tea and some of Mrs. Collins's shortbread cookies. "Yes, Charlotte never recovered from the delivery. She grew weaker and weaker, despite the best care available in Boston at the time." Mr. Marsh's face clouded with the memory. The doctors were baffled. There was no fever, no excessive bleeding, none of the usual complications of childbirth. She just faded away. And was there anything unusual about the pregnancy or birth itself? Mr. Marsh hesitated, turning his teacup in his hands. Charlotte was in perfect health throughout, though she often complained of being too warm, even in the depths of winter. She would open windows, walk barefoot on cold floors. The servants thought her mad, but she said she felt as if she were burning from within. He paused, lost in memory. When her labor began, everything seemed normal at first. But then she began to grow cold. Not just her extremities, but her entire body. By the time Evelyn was born, Charlotte's skin had taken on a bluish cast, not unlike what you observed in our daughter yesterday. That is unusual, Dr. Thornfield agreed. And there was no explanation? No family history of similar conditions? Mr. Marsh shook his head. Charlotte came from hardy New England stock, the Prescotts of Salem. No history of unusual ailments, though she did have a fascination with the sea. She would spend hours by the shore in all seasons, even in the coldest weather. Said it called to her. He gave a sad smile. I always thought it poetic fancy. But now I wonder. Wonder what, Mr. Marsh? The businessman sighed heavily. If there was something in her blood, too. Something she passed to our daughter. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Collins announcing dinner. The evening passed pleasantly enough, with Evelyn showing more animation than before, engaging the doctor in conversation about his studies and his microscope. She displayed a keen intelligence and curiosity that belied her years and frail condition. After dinner, while Mr. Marsh retired to write letters, Evelyn asked if she might borrow a book to read. Dr. Thornfield led her to his small library, where she browsed the shelves with evident delight. You have Darwin's Origin of Species, she noted, running her fingers along the spine of the controversial book. Do you subscribe to his theories, Doctor? I find them compelling, he admitted, though not without theological concerns. The idea that all life evolved from simpler forms through natural selection explains much about the natural world. Including human life? She asked, fixing him with that disconcertingly direct gaze. The evidence suggests so, yes. Then perhaps I am not an aberration, she said thoughtfully, but merely an adaptation, or a reversion to something more primitive. The doctor was struck by the sophistication of her thinking. You've read Darwin? Father believes in education even for daughters, she replied with a slight smile. Especially for daughters who are too frail for traditional female pursuits. She selected a volume of Tennyson's poetry and bid the doctor good night. Dr. Thornfield returned to his study where he spent hours documenting his observations of Evelyn's condition, drawing what he had seen in her blood and forming hypotheses that he knew sounded more like fantasy than science. The third day dawned clear and cold. Word came that the road to the next town had been cleared and would be passable by midday. Mr. Marsh made arrangements for their departure, settling his account with Dr. Thornfield and expressing his gratitude. I would be most interested to hear Dr. Winfield's findings, Dr. Thornfield said as they prepared to leave. Perhaps you might write to me once he's examined Evelyn. Of course, Mr. Marsh agreed, though something in his manner suggested to the doctor that he might not be entirely forthcoming in any future correspondence. As for Evelyn, she thanked the doctor with perfect politeness, but the brief connection he had felt with her seemed to have receded. She was once again the perfectly reserved Victorian daughter, her unusual insights and questions carefully contained. Just before entering the carriage, she turned back to him. You will continue to think about what you saw in my blood, won't you, doctor? Even after we're gone. I don't think I could stop if I tried, Miss Marsh, he replied honestly. She nodded, satisfied. Good. Someone should remember. Then she was gone, helped into the carriage by her father, the door closing firmly behind her. Dr. Thornfield watched the carriage disappear down the snow-covered road, an inexplicable sense of loss weighing on him. He returned to his office where the slides containing Evelyn's extraordinary blood still sat beside his microscope. Looking through the eyepiece one last time, he was startled to find that the patterns had changed. The movement had slowed, and the fluid had begun to separate into distinct layers of varying opacity. Even separated from its host, Evelyn's blood continued to defy explanation. True to his word, Mr. Marsh wrote to Dr. Thornfield 2 weeks later. The letter was polite but vague, stating only that Dr. Winfield had found Evelyn's condition most unusual and had prescribed a regimen of iron supplements and rest. There was no mention of the anomalous properties of her blood. The letter concluded with assurances that Evelyn was doing well, and that they had returned to their home in Boston. Dr. Thornfield filed the letter away, dissatisfied with its lack of detail but respecting Mr. Marsh's privacy. He might have put the case out of his mind entirely had it not been for the dreams that began to plague him, dreams of swirling patterns like those he had observed in Evelyn's blood, expanding until they filled an endless sea in which he found himself drowning. Spring came to Blackwood. The snow melted to reveal the first green shoots of new life. Dr. Thornfield's practice kept him busy, yet he found himself thinking of Evelyn Marsh with troubling frequency. He had preserved the slides containing her blood, though the substance had long since dried into unrecognizable patterns that bore little resemblance to the moving fluid he had first observed. In late April, he received an unexpected visitor. A woman arrived at his office dressed in the severe black of mourning, her face partially concealed by a heavy veil. When she raised it, he found himself looking at a handsome woman of middle years with features that seemed vaguely familiar. "Dr. Thornfield," she said, her voice cultured but tinged with grief. "My name is Eleanor Prescott. Charlotte Marsh was my sister. I believe you treated my niece Evelyn this past winter." The doctor invited her to sit, offering tea, which she declined. "I've come because Mr. Marsh is dead," she said without preamble. "An apparent suicide. He shot himself in his study 3 weeks ago. The authorities found him with a letter he'd written to me clutched in his hand, along with your name and address. The letter was disturbing," she continued, withdrawing a folded paper from her bag and handing it to the doctor. "It spoke of Evelyn in terms I found difficult to comprehend. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blotched in places as if written in great agitation. 'My dear Eleanor,' it began, 'by the time you read this, I will have departed this life, unable to bear any longer the burden of what I have witnessed and what I know must come. Evelyn, dear Evelyn, is not what she appears to be. What we took for illness these many years is something else entirely, a transformation. Dr. Thornfield in Blackwood saw it in her blood. Dr. Winfield confirmed it, though he dared not put his findings in writing, telling me privately what he observed under his microscope. She is changing, Eleanor, day by day becoming less human. The episodes of cold sleep, as she calls them, grow longer. After each, she returns to us more distant, her mind filled with thoughts she will not share, her eyes reflecting depths I cannot fathom. Last night I found her in the bath, submerged completely, the water grown cold around her. She had been there for hours. Yet when I pulled her out in terror, she showed no distress, no need for breath. I love my daughter, Eleanor. I have devoted my life to her care since Charlotte left us. But I know, that she is leaving us too, bound for somewhere I cannot follow. Dr. Thornfield saw the beginning of it. He might understand what is happening now. Seek him out. Tell him what I have told you. Perhaps science can yet explain what my heart cannot accept, that my daughter is becoming something other than human. Forgive me for what I am about to do. I cannot bear to witness the completion of this change, to see my Evelyn leave entirely, replaced by whatever is emerging from within her. Better to remember her as she was, my beautiful, strange, beloved child. The letter was signed simply, Edward. Dr. Thornfield read it twice, his hands trembling slightly. My condolences for your loss, Miss Prescott. This is indeed disturbing. But surely Mr. Marsh was suffering from some delusion brought on by grief or worry. That is what I told myself, she interrupted, until I went to collect Evelyn from the boarding school where Edward had placed her after their return from New York. The headmistress informed me that Evelyn had disappeared 3 days before Edward's death. No one saw her leave. Her bed was found empty one morning, the window open despite the chill. Her few possessions left behind, save for a volume of Tennyson's poetry. Dr. Thornfield recalled the book Evelyn had borrowed from his library on her last night in Blackwood, the same Tennyson volume she had returned to him before departing. The authorities are treating it as a kidnapping, Miss Prescott continued. But I found this among Evelyn's things. She handed him a folded piece of paper. On it, in a delicate, precise hand, was written, "The sea is calling. I must answer. "Do not look for me in familiar places." And below that, a line that the doctor recognized from Tennyson's The Kraken. "Below the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath in the abysmal sea." "I came to ask if you had any insight into my niece's condition," Miss Prescott said. "If there was anything in what you observed that might explain Edward's letter or Evelyn's disappearance." Dr. Thornfield hesitated. To share his observations would risk his professional reputation. The moving, cell-less blood defied all medical knowledge. Yet he owed this woman whatever truth he could offer. "Miss Marsh's blood was indeed unusual," he said carefully. "It lacked the cellular structures we would expect to find. Instead, it contained movement patterns, almost as if it were a different kind of substance entirely, merely disguised as blood rather than being true blood." Rather than the disbelief he expected, Miss Prescott nodded slowly. "My sister Charlotte was always drawn to the sea," she said quietly. "Even as a child, she would wade into the waves in all seasons, speaking of voices only she could hear. Our parents thought it a childish fancy she would outgrow, but she never did. When she met Edward, she made him promise to buy a house with a view of the ocean. After her death, he could not bear to remain there and moved inland to Boston." "You believe there's a connection between Mrs. Marsh's affinity for the sea and Evelyn's condition?" "I don't know what to believe, doctor, but I know my sister was different. Not in any way medicine could detect, but in her soul. She belonged to the sea in some way I never understood. And now it seems her daughter has answered the same call." The doctor sat back, considering this. "What will you do now, Miss Prescott?" "Honor my niece's wishes, I suppose. Not look for her in familiar places. But I would like to understand, if I can." Edward left a collection of journals. He documented Evelyn's condition meticulously from birth. "I've brought them, thinking they might be of use to your research." She indicated a leather bag at her feet. "Perhaps through science you might discover what became of my niece. And if you do, I will certainly contact you." After Miss Prescott departed, the doctor spent hours examining Edward Marsh's journals. They detailed 13 years of Evelyn's life from her unusual birth, during which Mr. Marsh noted the room had grown inexplicably cold and Charlotte's final words had been not of her husband or newborn daughter, but of returning to the deep, through each episode of cold sleep, growing more frequent and prolonged as Evelyn aged. The later entries chronicled Mr. Marsh's increasing desperation as he sought medical opinions, only to have doctors either declare themselves baffled or suggest that Evelyn's condition was some form of hysteria or pretense. The final entries, written after their return from New York, were disturbing in their frantic tone and increasingly paranoid observations. Mr. Marsh wrote of watching Evelyn through a keyhole as she sat motionless before a bowl of salt water for hours, of hearing her speak in her sleep in what he described as a language of liquid sounds, like water rushing through hidden caves, of finding patches of what appeared to be fine scales on her back that flaked away when touched. The last entry, dated 2 days before his suicide, read simply, "She is no longer my daughter. Perhaps she never was." Dr. Thornfield closed the journal, troubled by its contents yet fascinated as a scientist. If even half of what Mr. Marsh had recorded was accurate, Evelyn represented a medical anomaly of the highest order. But what had become of her? Had she, as the note suggested, gone to the sea? And if so, why? What call had she answered? In the months that followed, Dr. Thornfield found himself drawn to these questions with an intensity that surprised him. He began to research marine biology, corresponding with naturalists and requesting books from university libraries. He studied reports of unusual marine phenomena and folklore accounts of sea creatures throughout history. He even traveled to Boston during his summer holiday to visit the Marsh home, now closed up and for sale, and to walk along the shore where Charlotte Marsh had once listened to voices in the waves. Standing on that rocky beach, watching the gray Atlantic surge and retreat, he could almost imagine he heard something too, not voices precisely, but a kind of rhythm, a pattern in the sound that reminded him of the movement he had observed in Evelyn's blood. It was then that a theory began to form in his mind, one so outlandish that he dared not speak it aloud or commit it to paper, yet one that seemed to explain the inexplicable. What if evolution, as Darwin proposed, was not a one-way journey from sea to land? What if, in rare instances, it could reverse direction? What if there existed in some humans a genetic memory of their marine origins, a cellular yearning to return to the primordial waters from which all life had emerged? And what if, in even rarer cases, that yearning manifested physically? The idea was absurd, unscientific, yet it haunted him. He recalled Evelyn's words, "Perhaps I am not an aberration, but merely an adaptation, or a reversion to something more primitive." His research led him to accounts of people throughout history who had demonstrated unusual affinities for water, abnormal abilities to withstand cold or extended periods without breathing. Most were dismissed as frauds or exaggerations. But what if some had been like Evelyn? What if what he had witnessed in her blood movement without cellular structure was not an absence of cells, but a different kind of cellular organization entirely, one adapted for a different environment? Winter returned to Blackwood, bringing with it memories of the strange girl who had briefly entered his life. On the anniversary of her visit, Dr. Thornfield found himself unable to sleep, drawn instead to his study where he still kept the dried slides of her blood. On an impulse, he placed one under his microscope, not expecting to see anything but the familiar, meaningless patterns left by the dried fluid. What he saw instead sent a chill through him. The dried substance had absorbed moisture from the air and rehydrated itself. Under the lens, it was moving again, the patterns more defined than before, forming and reforming into shapes that reminded him of sea creatures. Jellyfish, anemones, things more primitive still. As he watched, transfixed, he became aware of a presence in the room. Turning slowly, he found Evelyn Marsh standing in the doorway of his study. She was changed. Her auburn hair had darkened to a deep, almost black hue with an iridescent quality that caught the lamplight. Her skin was paler than ever but had a translucent quality, revealing hints of blue veins beneath. Her eyes, with their strangely swirling irises, seemed larger, more luminous. She wore a simple dress of sea green, damp at the hem as if she had walked through water. "Miss Marsh," he breathed, disbelieving his own eyes. "How? Why are you here?" "To thank you, Doctor," she said, her voice carrying a new resonance, like water flowing over stones. "And to show you that your theories are correct." "My theories? I don't understand." She smiled, a secretive curve of lips that now seemed fuller, almost blue-tinged. "About adaptation, reversion, evolution's backward flow. You've been researching it, haven't you? Trying to understand what you saw in my blood." "How could you know that?" "I know many things now, Doctor. The sea teaches patience and perception." She moved into the room with a fluid grace, her movements suggesting the gentle sway of underwater plants. "My father could not accept what I was becoming. He feared it. But you sought to understand it. That deserves recognition." "What are you becoming, Evelyn?" he asked, finding his voice. "I'm returning," she said simply, "to an older form of life, to where I belong. Where my mother belonged, though she fought against it until the end. The sea, there are more of us than you might imagine, scattered throughout humanity. Most never know what they are, never hear the call clearly enough to answer it. They live their lives on land, always feeling somehow displaced. But some of us, the lucky ones, undergo the change. But how is it possible? Physiologically, anatomically, science has its limits, Doctor," she interrupted gently. "Some mysteries exist in the spaces between what can be observed and what can be known. My blood was your first clue. Life organized differently not by discrete cells, but by patterns of movement, like the currents of the deep sea." She approached his desk, looking down at the microscope. "May I?" He nodded, stepping aside. She bent to look through the eyepiece at her own blood, now reanimated. "Beautiful," she murmured. "It remembers." "Remembers what?" "Its true nature, just as I remembered mine." She straightened, fixing him with those otherworldly eyes. "I've come to say goodbye properly, and to offer you a choice." "A choice?" "To continue your research, to publish what you've observed, though I doubt anyone would believe you without evidence, or to let this mystery remain where it belongs, in the depths." Dr. Thornfield considered this. The scientist in him cried out for discovery, for revelation. But another part of him, perhaps wiser, recognized the beauty in mystery, the necessity of the unknown. "If I were to publish my observations," he said slowly, "what would become of others like you? Those who might still be in transition, vulnerable." Her gaze was steady. They would be studied, dissected, perhaps. Their journey interrupted or corrupted. He nodded, coming to a decision. "Then I will keep your secret, Miss Marsh. Though I confess I will always wonder. What becomes of us? Where we go, what we become in the deepest waters." She finished for him. She smiled, and for a moment he glimpsed something ancient and knowing behind her human features. Perhaps that is a mystery best left unsolved. She moved toward the door, her movements flowing like water finding its path. "Dawn approaches, and I must return to the sea before the sun rises. It becomes difficult to maintain this form in daylight. Will I see you again?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "No," she said gently. "My transition is nearly complete. Soon I will leave the shallows for the deep ocean, where the pressure would crush human lungs and the cold would still human hearts. But I will remember you, Dr. Thornfield, as one who sought to understand rather than fear." She paused at the threshold. "One last thing, my Aunt Eleanor Prescott grieves for me, though I am not truly gone. Perhaps you could tell her that I am at peace, that I have found where I belong." "I will," he promised. "Goodbye, Doctor. May you find your own true nature, as I have found mine." And then she was gone, leaving behind only a faint scent of salt and a dampness on the floor where she had stood. Dr. Thornfield rushed to the window, throwing it open to the cold night air. In the distance, he could see a figure moving toward the river that ran at the edge of town, flowing eventually to the sea. The figure paused, turned back as if sensing his gaze, and raised a hand in final farewell. Then it slipped into the dark waters and was gone. The doctor kept his promise. He never published his observations of Evelyn's blood or shared his theories about her condition. He visited Eleanor Prescott to deliver Evelyn's message, finding some comfort in the woman's quiet acceptance. "Charlotte always said the sea would claim her children," she told him. "I'm glad Evelyn found peace in answering its call." Years passed. Dr. Thornfield continued his practice in Blackwood, respected as a man of science and reason. If he sometimes stood on the banks of the river, gazing downstream toward the distant ocean, or if he kept a dried slide of most unusual blood locked in his desk drawer, no one remarked upon it. And if on nights when storms lashed the coast and the wind carried the scent of salt inland, he thought he heard a voice in the rain that reminded him of a girl with swirling eyes and a secret older than humanity itself, well, that was a mystery he had chosen to leave unsolved. For science, he had learned, did not have all the answers. Some things existed in the spaces between knowledge and wonder, in the deep currents that moved beneath the surface of the world, in blood that contained no cells, only movement, ancient, purposeful, and free. In his final years, as his own blood slowed and his sight dimmed, Dr. Thornfield often dreamed of the sea, not as a place of terror, but as one of transformation and return. In these dreams, he would sometimes glimpse a figure moving in the depths, with flowing dark hair and eyes that swirled like smoke, who would smile at him with recognition before disappearing into the abyssal darkness. And though he remained a man of science to the end, James Thornfield died with the conviction that some mysteries were not meant to be explained, only witnessed, honored, and remembered in the spaces between heartbeats, like the eternal rhythm of the tide. The sea, he had come to understand, kept its own secrets, and perhaps that was as it should be.